So I'm Judy Lissick, and I'm a member of the Northeast Metro Climate Action Group. We're a volunteer group of local residents from the Northeast Metro, Matamidi to Fridley, Lino Lakes to Little Canada. Our goal is to broaden awareness of the reality and implications of climate change, and we do this by working to educate our neighbors, community members, and elected officials. We would welcome anybody to join us. And you can reach out to us on our Facebook page, our website. We would, if you want to give us your email, we would use it strictly to continue to invite you to educational events. We have them about once a month. You can send in a private chat tonight. You can send a message to Facebook or through the website, and we'll just add you to our mailing list. Tonight's educational event is, we've already heard a little bit from Erin O'Leary, even though it says Alyssa Thompson. That's actually Erin O'Leary from Landbridge Ecological, and she's going to talk about conservation techniques for nature-friendly lawns, which is extremely relevant as we get into spring here in Minnesota. We would like people to hold your questions till the end. You can put them in the chat. Or at the end, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you. And Erin is very open to taking any questions anybody may have. So I will turn it over to Erin.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I love to talk about this kind of thing, and I'm just started my timer, so I stay on track. But as Judy mentioned, my name's Erin O'Leary. I am the Installation Services Coordinator for Landbridge Ecological. And Landbridge Ecological, just a quick little blurb about us. We are an ecological restoration company, and we focus on installing native landscapes and the management of those landscapes. And that can be anything from a small rain garden in a residential backyard to hundreds of acres in a public park. We also do invasive species management and management for the care of those native places. We're a little different from the other companies that are around the metro area and in the state, in that we are fully entrenched in a design-based business. Our owner is a landscape architect. This is a career change for me, and I came from an interior design background before I went back and got my master's in ecological restoration. So we have a crew and a team that loves to work with residents on designing beautiful natural landscapes in their own yard. A lot of times the perception with native landscapes is that they're big open prairies or CRPs, and they actually can be quite beautifully designed and provide a lot of ecological benefits. So without further ado, I'm going to start talking about the one question I'd like you guys to focus on while I am talking is, what does nature mean to you? So this is a map of where I grew up. I am from a Northwest Chicago suburb called Palatine. I grew up in the suburbs, and even though that was some 30 odd years ago at this point, not much has changed in this area. It is your classic urban suburban suburb. Lots of homes crammed into small tracts of land. Nature was, if you can see just north of the red box on the left-hand side here, there's a large golf course. There is an infiltration pond behind our townhouse development, and there were a lot of Canada geese. So we experience a lot of that here in the metro as well. And it's not uncommon, but I was fortunate enough that my parents, like many people here in Minnesota, we had a cabin north of us in Wisconsin. And while it was pretty much jail for me growing up through junior high and high school, we still own this property, and it is 80 acres of remnant prairie and red oak, red pine, or white pine forest. It's a beautiful place. My dogs love to run, and this is Sophie, one of my dogs. And this is a beautiful stretch of prairie. We are actually located about 15 miles from the Nisita Wildlife National Wildlife Refuge. And it actually hosts the largest population of the Karner blue butterfly, which is a protected species and in decline. The Karner blue butterfly is extremely dependent upon wild native lupin, Lupinus perennis, and it uses it as a host plant for its larva. And we're going to talk a little bit about the relationship between native plants and uh, native plants and their host species of insects later on. So when I got to grow up here, I did get to experience plants and flowers and trees and butterflies and insects, and we looked for wild blueberries in the woods, and we harvested sumac berries and made tea out of it, and we did get to look for wild strawberries that were in the sand, and all of these wonderful things, and see deer and turkey and all these kinds of things. So I did get to experience this even though I was a city kid. And a lot of children today don't get to experience those things. And we certainly didn't have the internet and cell phones and all of the other distractions back then. And we honestly rarely watched TV unless it was Dallas on Friday night after the Dukes of Hazzards. And nowadays our kids don't get to experience that as even with cabins up north. I think a lot of times the kids are plugged in, and I was very fortunate to be able to grow up to this when I look back now. And nature to me has always been, you know, the outdoors and the animals and the birds and the butterflies and playing in the dirt and being told to go and explore. And it's a very important part of my life, and it actually has really pushed me in this career now. But what does nature mean to you all? Is nature, or one version of it, what brought you here this evening to listen to this talk? Um, does nature, when somebody says nature, do you picture a river bend? Maybe the mighty Mississippi or the St. Croix, which we get to experience here in Minnesota? Do you think of deer at the forest edge or in your backyard? Or maybe Canada geese walking along your lawn? Do you think of a beautiful meadow full of wildflowers? Or do you think of nature in this sense, more formal and traditional landscapes with beautiful perennial borders and lovely trees and shrubs that are ornamental? Regardless of what you think of nature and what that means to you, when we speak of nature in the ecological restoration trade, we're talking about plants. And we get really geeky on plants. And this picture and this image here is kind of our, I guess what I would call our Bible. So this is what we call the Marshner map. This map was created and is a biological record, or botanical record, I should say, of the state of Minnesota prior to European settlement. And so that would have been the Public Land Survey, as you can see at the top, was between 1847 and 1907. And they literally surveyed the plant vegetation in the state at that time. At that time, there was about 180 million acres of vegetation and about 18 million acres of prairie. And the prairie here is represented by the yellow tones on the western and southern part of the state. There's a pretty hard line of vegetation and forest that meets at that green level. And if you think about it, that's where the Mississippi River is, and where it comes into more of the wet areas. And the purples and the blue colors represent kind of the coniferous forests, the bogs, and everything that would have been found up in the Northeast. And the reason for that kind of hard line and why that those trees that decided to start growing in those areas was because prairie traditionally is a fire dependent ecosystem, but fire traditionally will burn out when it encounters areas of moisture, which would have been found at the rivers. And because fire would be suppressed in those areas, that would give the trees the opportunity to grow And so then those areas became forested. Why is that important to us today? So today, this is what we're really experiencing in Minnesota. So we see the yellow where we used to have prairie, and the red in those areas is what is remnant now. And it is approximately, we're down to about 18,000 acres from what we were at previously. And those areas are, again, they follow some waterways. They are in areas where it's rocky, which wouldn't have been able to be tilled with agriculture. But most of that area now is heavily in agriculture. And so we have these opportunities, and we can see kind of why this type of an ecosystem, which we call grasslands, is so endangered, because those prairies created beautiful, rich soil, which in turn was perfect for cultivating agricultural products like corn and soybeans. So what are we going to do about that? And why is it so important for us to have native plants? And the discussion that we're bringing up now is native plants. So native plants are any plant that's or any species, I should say, that is indigenous to a given location. And native plants can be trees, shrubs. It doesn't have to, we just don't speak about grasses and flowers. For example, this is pasque flower. It is happiest in open, scrubby, sandy soils where it gets lots of light. It's one of the first things to bloom in the prairie in the springtime. And you can see that this actually was an area that had been burned. And the grasses that are around it, you can see the remnants of it, and it's black from the ash, and it's springing forth because now it has some space and some sunlight because that competition has gone away. And what are the benefits of these native plants? So native plants offer many benefits, and particularly to insects, but we're going to get into that in a little bit. But the biggest thing with native plants is what they provide from an ecological standpoint and in soil conservation. Native plants have extensive root structures. Some species of grasses can reach 10 feet into the soil. Some flower species, for example, lead plant, has a root structure that reaches 15 feet into the soil. When we talk about those kinds of biomass, and when we look at native plants, we kind of discuss and say, look at them as an iceberg, where 25% is what we get to see and experience, but 75% of that plant is actually below the surface of the soil. And all of that, and what that does is that anchors the soil to the ground, so we reduce erosion. That massive root structure helps to take up water, and so we have less water running across the landscape and actually being absorbed into the landscape. And the other thing too is by creating these big dense mass root structures underground, we create pockets of aeration and organic material that benefits the soil and the creatures that live in it. But what does that mean for us? I mean, how do we really use that? I mean, this is a discussion on how we can create ecologically sound backyards in our homes. So why I don't want to have, we get a lot is like, I don't want it to look wild. Why would I use native plants? And on and on and on. So another thing with native plants that I like to talk about is, and especially from a conservation standpoint, is when we talk about, ideally, we talk about right plant for the right place. A lot of times when we have those beautiful traditional landscapes that are over manicured and they're just, everything is perfect and there's always something blooming, we have to think about what goes into that plant to make that happen. With a native plant, and if we choose a plant that would have been found, and we kind of use that Marshner map as our guide, what we're looking at is we're picking a plant that evolved into that space over hundreds and thousands of years, literally. So when we talk about native plants and putting that right plant in that right place, we're utilizing plants that are adapted to the local climate and to the soil conditions that they would have been found before any of us were ever here. Um, and as I spoke earlier, their extensive root structures provide drought tolerance. So if you've ever walked by native plants in the heat of August, they'll always be bright and cheery and happy. Part of that is because that root structure is so stretched into the ground, they are accessing water from the water table, and they're not relying on a rain event or your sprinkler system to keep them alive. If you have a shoreline up north and you have a cabin up on a lake, using native plants and native grasses on your shoreline, you're not going to run into erosion control problems. That wave action, if you have turf coming down or you feel like you have to put riprap in to hold that soil in place, native plants actually and their root structure can help hold that soil in there for you. People talk about planting trees for carbon sequestration. Native grasses and native flowers actually can hold more carbon in the soil and release it on a better basis than trees do. So when a large tree dies and that starts to decay or comes out of the system, that releases huge amounts of carbon into the air, where plants like a prairie grass, they hold that carbon into their root structure, and that decomposes at a much slower rate. Excuse me. And then the benefits of keeping water from running across the land and actually being taken in and increasing that water filtration is another purpose too. What we need to focus on from an urban standpoint in utilizing native plants in our yard is really more starting at the base level, and what lives in these native plantings. And when we look at native plants, we are providing basically the base level for invertebrates, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. And the starting thing that we're all talking about now, especially, and if you think about bees and butterflies as an example of that, is those invertebrates. And those invertebrates utilize plants for their nursery. They utilize it as a food source, and they utilize plants as shelter. And then by creating those diverse environments, that increases the amount of insects and other small invertebrates that visit those plants. You are providing then a food source for other things like reptiles, amphibians, and birds. So if you plant those flowers and we bring those insects in, we create what's called a diverse community. So the more plants you have, because most of our native insects, and one fun fact is that in Minnesota, they have now identified over 450 different species of bees alone, native bees, not honeybees, native bees. And that's just one family or one class of family in the insect world. And a lot of those species are what we call specialized. So that insect has developed over time along with these plants, and they've become specialized to depend on those plants. And the biggest example that I think most understand and have heard about would be the monarch butterfly and milkweeds. Milkweed, when you break milkweed, it has the milky sap inside, and that sap is actually toxic to most plants or to most animals and other insects. But the milkweed has evolved along with the monarch butterfly. And over time, they have developed a resistance to that toxicity. And actually, by consuming that plant, that butterfly actually becomes toxic to others, which is why they have the fancy orange and black warning coloring on their wings. Because birds then know not to eat monarch butterflies because they'll become ill because of the toxic effects of the milkweed that they eat on. So most people don't understand, but maybe you do, that the monarch butterfly doesn't necessarily need milkweed to eat. they need it as a host plant for the larva. So the caterpillars eat the milkweed. The monarch butterfly actually needs other native plants like that are high in nectar, and one of them, for example, that their favorite is blazing stars. And they utilize other species of native plants for their survival to get them down to Mexico and back. And once they've laid their eggs on milkweed, they don't have anything else to do with milkweeds. So when we talk about native plants and insects and the relationship between them, we're really talking about this specialized relationship between certain individuals of insects and those species of plants. And the more plants we can provide and the different varieties of plants, the more insects that we're more likely to bring into our yards. And if we bring a lot of insects into our yards, we're also going to get, as a byproduct of that, more birds. So songbirds, a majority of their diet actually are insects, and the young of birds, oops, not yet. The majority of the young will feed solely on insects. So by creating a diverse environment of plants that would then bring in a diverse environment of insects, you're going to increase the diversity of the birds that come to visit, because just like you and me, we all have something that we like to eat more than others. And if we get different options, we're going to bring in we're going to have, sorry, my dog's in the background. We're going to bring in a more diverse variety of songbirds into our yards. And even in the city, you know, we're seeing, as people are installing and putting in more native plants in their own yards, we are seeing a greater diversity of birds in the city, things that we would normally see out in the country. Okay, oops, sorry. So it's not all good news. And fortunately, I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, how you want to look at it, the decline of bees or honeybees, which actually isn't a native species, and the decline of the monarch caterpillar, as we see up in the upper right, has brought awareness to the plight and the decline of these insects and basically the native plants that they have grown accustomed to. And we hope that it's not too little too late. The reports for the monarch butterfly came out and numbers are down again. As you can see from this monarch watch, the numbers of the monarch are dropping and they are becoming a serious problem. And there is a very good chance that in our lifetimes, we will see the extinction of the monarch. But what can we do to help? And where did it all go? At one point, we used to have over 900 million acres of habitat in North America. But now we have agriculture and we have urbanization and we have turf landscapes. And now turf landscapes occupy over 40 million acres in the continental US. And unfortunately, 75% of that is found in our residential landscapes. And that includes everything, not just necessarily from our backyards, but that includes athletic fields and other areas like that, parks. The bottom left picture shows that turf edge going right down to the water, and their attempt to put in some kind of retaining wall to keep that soil in place, because that turf structure and that root structure below it is only 3/4 of an inch deep. Where if we had our native plants on that shoreline, we would have had 15 feet of root structure, basically going even deeper and into the water level below, holding that soil in place. So this slide talks about the correlation of habitat and surviving species. And ecologists point out to us that there is a 1-to-1 correlation. So for every, for the percentage of habitat that is left, there is an equal percentage of the surviving population of species that can inhabit that habitat. So if we are down to 1% of habitat left remaining for wild species, only 1% of the entire population of wild species will be alive and able to survive in that. It's pretty dire, but we can take steps to correct that. And part of that is by planting native plants. So what kind of native plants? The biggest question that I always get in my work is, well, I don't have a sunny yard. Sorry, I have a dog who loves me. And I've been gone at work all day. So the biggest thing I always get is like, well, I can't use native plants because my yard is in total shade. Well, if you think about Minnesota and how many wooded acres that Minnesota has and how many trees that Minnesota has, you have to think that at some point, some plant somewhere has evolved to grow in the shade. And woodland native plants are some of the most beautiful flowers that we have in Minnesota. And right now is the time to go out and see them. Some examples are trillium, meadow rue, all kinds of wonderful sedges, Virginia waterleaf, wild geranium, all kinds of lovely things. And they bloom this time of year because there's actually a lot of sun that penetrates to the forest floors, where in the summertime, when it's very warm, a different group of species will come, or you'll get a lot of just vegetation that has texture. If you live near water or you have a lot of water on your property, there are beautiful wetland plants, wild iris, Canada anemone. If you're like me, who I think is the luckiest of them all, I live in the sand plain, and most prairie species thrive in sandy, dry soils that never see rain. But figuring out what your plant community could be in your own yard is a part of this process. And converting small portions of your landscape to native plants can help save pollinators and other wildlife. So let's really start talking about your yard and the benefits of that. I have put on the screen here an example of my piece of property. I don't live in the city. I live in Andover, which is just north of Anoka, and I live in what's called the Anoka Sand Plain. And I moved here 13 years ago, pardon me, from central Iowa. And central Iowa has the most beautiful black soil you can ever imagine. I literally wouldn't have to plant tomato plants in my yard year to year because the seeds from the tomatoes from the previous year would just start growing in the spring. And even by June, they would be like 6 to 8 inches tall. So I never even had to start tomato plants. I would just leave a few on the ground in the fall and they would overwinter and germinate. When I moved up here, I was really shocked at how very little things like to grow in the sand. And I would try, and I would go to the garden centers, and I would go to Gertens, and I would go to Mickman Brothers, and I would spend hundreds of dollars on plants every year, and I would stick them in the ground, and I would water them and baby them and fertilize them and amend it with peat moss. And they would survive for maybe 2 seasons, and then they would die. And I was getting so frustrated. And then I read a book, and the book was called Bringing Nature Home, and it's by Doug Tallamy, Dr. Doug Tallamy. And it's a very thin little book. And I had heard him speak at a seminar, and he talked about how our urban environments have become this basic food desert for animals. We have beautiful manicured lawns that have tons of inputs with fertilizer, and we irrigate them and so that they're perfectly green. And then we put all of these trees and shrubs in there that have beautiful flowers, but the flowers provide no nourishment for insects, and on and on and on. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And he starts talking about native plants. And I do a little research, and fortunately, living here in Minnesota, there's so much information about native plants. We're really very, very fortunate compared to the rest of the country, the resources that we have from a native plant standpoint. And I went up to Prairie Restorations. I drove up to Princeton. I went to their garden center, and I was like, this is not like a normal garden center. What are all these weird little species I've never heard of? And I started talking to them up there, and I took home a little flat of native plants that were going to grow in the shade. She promised me they loved shade and they loved sand. And I stuck them in the ground and I watered them, and those things took off. And that was wild geranium and Virginia waterleaf. And I have ever since then never bought another 6-pack of those, because all I have to do every spring is dig them up and stick them in other places in my yard, and they cover in the weirdest places. So you can see on the screen, there's 3 purple circles. And those purple circles, and even the tree line up, like wrapped around the like L shape on my house, those are all red pine. And red pine, they're 30-foot tall. They were planted there a long time ago, and they are just a mat of pine needles underneath, and not an ounce of sun gets into those areas. And underneath there right now is just a carpet of green, native, ephemeral Minnesota species. And they're beautiful. The red areas are closer to my house. The little triangle is the front entrance where my front door is, and the larger red circle in the back is where a colony of quaking aspen are. And both of those areas get quite a bit of sun in the heat of the day. And so that has a different community of plants growing there. Lots of blazing stars and coneflowers and little blue stem. And in the back, it's a little bit more wild, and I'll have another picture showing that. In the front, it's right along my walkway. I want it to be tidy. It has bark mulch. It's very pretty. I baby it. It has some shrubs in there too. And it's very formal, but it's using all native species, all native plants to Minnesota. The area at the bottom with the teal blue color, I realize now when I'm looking at this, they're kind of the same. I have a little bit of woods. I have bur oak and red oak mostly, but I also have some pine trees that were stuck back there. That 2585 is the back side on the next street over. So our properties butt up together. And in the woods, it was completely choked out with buckthorn. And one winter I went in there, and my husband saw me outside in the winter, and he was like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm getting rid of this buckthorn. It's bad. And that spring, after we cleared it all out, I found, again, wild geranium. I didn't even have to go to Prairie Restorations to buy it. I have it in my backyard. I have ferns, and I have meadow rue, and I have all of these other amazing things. And they just keep growing and growing and growing because I've released that competition from those invasive species back there. I've put in a seed mix that's considered more savanna-y. So there's American bellflower blooming back there, and figwort, and other very big, tall species. And I love going back there in the middle of the summer when they're blooming purple and they're just covered in bees. And then the largest part, which most people obviously in a city lot are not going to have the space for, but I have about 3.5 acres of short, dry prairie growing. And this is a little bit of an example of what this looks like. So the picture on the left is my dog Lucy running through the prairie after we burned this spring. We haven't had rain since I burned, and every day she comes back inside and she has ash all over her feet and it's driving me crazy. And I'm really glad I have hardwood floors and not white carpet. um, the picture on the right was the summer after the last time I burned, which was about 5 years ago. And that is the short dry prairie around my house. And that completely surrounds my house. So it's a pretty amazing way to frame your backyard. And the reason it's so prolific is if you imagine a plant holds energy in itself, and when you burn it, that energy is released back into the ground in the form of ash. And all of those essentially like nutrients that the plant was holding in itself is released back into the ground, and it's a way of fertilizing essentially your prairie, and all of those plants benefit from that, and you get a huge bloom burst and the grasses grow extra tall, and it's pretty impressive. But why do I plant native plants? Because they're not just for insects, they're really for all wildlife. So that red circle that was in the middle of my yard, and I should say I have 3 hunting dogs, but every year I always find them because I see the mom fly away, but my dogs fortunately miss them. We get a lot of ground sparrows, and this was a nest I found in my backyard, right in the middle of my backyard. And we get all kinds of wonderful little butterflies and moths and other types of things flying around. And this is a skipper on dotted horsemint or spotted monarda. And this was that winter that I was clearing buckthorn out from my woods. I was on a chainsaw. I saw my husband staring at me. I looked up, I turned and looked over my shoulder, and this deer had walked up right behind me. And this is not staged. This is in my backyard. Now, we have a herd of deer that I think is pretty used to people, but I have never had a wild deer walk up this close to me before. But they appreciate the open woods to walk through. So the first thing I want to talk about when we talk about how we can make your backyard beneficial in a conservation area for nature is we have to analyze your site. So we're going to look at the size and the shape of your backyard. We're going to talk about the area that maybe you want to convert. We're going to talk about, aspect and slope, which is just really a fancy name for like the terrain and how much light you get from the sun, and at one time of the day the sun hits your backyard. And we're going to talk about how water moves across your yard. Do you live on a slope and you have a neighborhood above you that you get runoff from? Do you have slope in your yard and all the water pours off of your house and goes right out into the street or down your driveway? Those are all things we want to think about, because ideally we'd like to capture all that water and keep it on your property so you don't have to water your lawn and things like that. We want to talk about your soil type. We can do, there's actually a website called Web Soil Survey. It's a government funded website, and you can put in your address and it will tell you exactly what your soil is, or you can dig a hole. We want to look at the existing vegetation and what's growing up above and might possibly limit your light conditions. So are you going to convert a turf lawn into a native planting bed? Do you want to convert that lawn into something that might be more beneficial and not need as many inputs that maybe you're doing? And when I say inputs, I'm talking about how many times a week do you mow it? Are you fertilizing it 3 times a year? Are you putting weed suppressant down, so you don't get crabgrass and dandelions? This picture up in the top left shows a lawn of what we would call no-mow fescue. And it is a type of turf that grows to about 6 inches and then lodges over and creates this beautiful, soft, dense mat of vegetation that you don't mow, you don't water, you don't put fertilizer on. And I think it's beautiful. And last, how much lawn do you really need in your yard? And like I said, I have I have 3 dogs. They love to run around. They are a hunting breed. They're crazy. I they I've got them kind of trained to go out in the prairie, so I don't really have to pick it up in the yard. But we have friends and we like, we like to entertain and we like to play croquet out in the backyard. And so I want turf in my yard to a point. What I don't want to do is sit on a lawnmower all weekend. When we first moved into our house, it used to take me 4.5 hours on a riding lawnmower with a 36-inch deck, and I've got that down to about an hour and 15 minutes. Because I keep killing grass every year, which my husband love hates. Um, but I also understand too, when you have neighbors that are closer and you live in a traditional neighborhood and you have a city lot, there is a certain level of expectation by your neighbors. And some people that we encounter, they're like, it's my property, I can do what I want. And then others want to maintain, a cohesive look in the neighborhood. That's why you live in a neighborhood. And so they want to find alternatives, but at the same time, they also want to, be a good neighbor. um, One of the biggest problems that I think urban homeowners who want to convert to native plants encounter is the fact that the miseducation or misunderstanding of what they're doing in their yard, and the perception that it's somebody that's just left their lawn to go and they just don't take care of it anymore. So, how do we find that balance? Another thing we talk about when you're planning is an important thing that's called edge effects. And the edge effects is really important when you're choosing your plants and how you're going to create that space for them. Um, Edges are a place where there's typical disturbance, so you can lose, you can you can invite a lot of weedy species into those edges because you're constantly walking by, you're mowing that lawn right next to it, et cetera, et cetera. The edge is where you're going to get the most light. So is it something that's at the front of your lawn and then behind you've got a lot of trees? So at the front you're going to have a lot of sun, but at the back you're going to have a lot of shade. These are different things we have to think about so that we're putting the plants in the right place for those areas. Um, and then the other thing is just like how will water and air flow into those areas as well from the edge. Topography and hydrology are also another thing that we like to think about. And again, when we talk hydrology in the city, or where the water flows in the city, a big thing that the cities are dealing with now specifically is the impermeable surfaces that come along with development and growth in a city. And that just means all of the pavement that can't absorb the water. And so the water runs across it. So when we talk about these native plantings and how we can make our backyards more nature friendly, is what can we do with the topography of our yard to keep water on site after a rain event? And what that means is, like, when that rain hits your roof or it hits your driveway or your sidewalks, how can we keep that water on site so that it goes in through the soil instead of running down the driveway and into the storm sewers? And then we do like to just talk about, like, what do you want to get out of this? Are you looking to bring in more bees and butterflies? Are you looking to create less maintenance for you? These are all things that we should take into consideration, because even though native species are low maintenance, they're not no maintenance. We want to choose how we're going to prepare the site. We have to deal with more and more cities who don't let us use certain herbicides in public areas. And that can make preparing a site challenging. There's different things that the Xerces Society suggests, like solarization, which would be utilizing plastic to heat the soil to kill any of the species in there that would reduce competition. Smothering, like with cardboard. And all of those things are really great ideas, but they also work only in a certain scale. So, we talk about people and they're like, oh, well, I want to solarize it, but it's an acre. So are you going to put an acre of plastic down and kill it that way. What are you going to do with all that plastic after the fact? So there's different things that we have to consider, because while no one wants to use chemicals, we do not like to use it, but we understand that it's a kind of a necessary evil, and it makes our job more cost effective and faster for people. But we also look at things too, like, well, can we just keep tilling it and tilling it and tilling it? So we take the energy out of the plants that are on site now, and we have to delay that planting for like a year or maybe two. Do you have the patience to wait for that much time to prepare the area correctly? So these are all things that we want to take into consideration before we start this project. And then the plant installation. You know, plants are expensive. Right now, I have never seen the demand for plants as high as it is. I believe because everybody is stuck at home, we're all looking out into our yards. We have more flexibility to be outside in nature, and the demand on plant material is just through the roof right now. All of my vendors I talk to, they're just crazed. They don't know, they've never seen anything like this. Well, because of that, and we have to think about plants as a commodity, you know, there's a supply and demand issue, and that can raise prices. So do we want to start with small plant material and be patient, wait for it to get bigger, or do we want instant gratification? Are we going to go to big plants? Are we going to use wildflowers? Are we going to put grasses? Are we going to use trees and shrubs? Because we shouldn't forget those as well. These are all things that we can take into consideration. And then how are we going to take care of it in the end? Maintenance is the most important thing for a native planting. As I said before, they're low maintenance areas, not no maintenance. And there's specifically the most important time for maintenance is during what we call the establishment period. Sometimes we want to mow, we want to limit the type of herbicide. So if we have weeds growing in there, we need to make a determination, or can we pull them? Can we mow them back? Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. And in the end, we can use fire for maintenance as well.
Erin, while you're getting your voice back, I put a couple things in the chat that people might be interested in. First of all, the University of Minnesota has a bee lab and a bee squad, and they have some really good resources on their webpage for lists of plants that attract pollinators for shady areas, sunny areas. So that's one really good resource. And then they're also promoting something called No Mow May, which is allowing the plants in your lawn and in the areas that you normally would mow to grow a little bit longer and provide a little more habitat for bees in the early spring. So it's a good excuse to not have to mow your lawn.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I have tree allergies now, and the pollen has just been horrible this season. So when I talk too long, my throat dries out, and if I don't drink fast enough, then that just happens. So I apologize. I am so sorry.
Erin, while you're also catching your voice there, in your chat, there have been some questions sent to you. And we're
Okay.
just a little bit short on time here. So if you want to kind of wrap your piece up, and maybe you could answer one or two of the questions that you've gotten.
Sure. I was just going to talk and show a couple of examples that I think are wonderful to plant into your lawn to get that taste and to start converting that bee lawn kind of effect. Prairie smoke and harebell. These are all lovely little species that grow about a foot tall. And when you mow them, they grow even shorter and they keep blooming. So you can kind of trick them. Phlox, prairie clovers. One thing that the University of Minnesota is finding is that a lot of a certain species of butterfly called skippers are very dependent upon native grasses. And some of our native grasses like little bluestem and prairie dropseed are lovely in a very formal bed. They provide a lot of wonderful texture. Another really wonderful place is local author Heather Holm. She has a fantastic website and she's created these plant species cards, and they are for light conditions and soils. And so you can just look up like, I have heavy clay soil, what will grow there? And she has a card and shows what kind of plants and insects will go with those plants. And I put up a couple of other resources for people to contact. You know, we have a Master Gardener and a Master Naturalist Association here in Minnesota. Our University of Minnesota Extension Office is always quite knowledgeable. The Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, or Bowser, has their Lawns to Legumes program. Most watersheds have some kind of grant or cost share program to convert native plants in your backyards. So definitely look into that and take advantage of that. A lot of money goes unspent every year because people don't know that they have that option available to them. And the most important thing, I think, when you're looking for native plants is buying from a reputable grower and somebody that's not wild harvesting, that can tell you the genetic origin of where the seed or the plants came from. And native, remember, is, you know, the United States has native plants, but they may not be native to Minnesota. So when you see things like wildflower in a can at Lowe's or Home Depot, many of those species can even be invasive to Minnesota. So again, it's just that question, what does nature mean to you? I think it's different for every single person I've ever talked to, but it doesn't mean that there's any one right answer. We just need to find out what nature is right for you. And that's all I have for you. Does anybody have any questions? I'm gonna.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Erin. If people, you can certainly put a question in the general chat. And I know a few people have sent Erin you message in the private chat. If you can get to your chat and read that.
Oh, okay. Is that? There it is.
And if anybody, you see them raise their hand on the screen, they may have a question too.
Okay. And can you talk about bee lawns? So bee lawns are the new thing. And their Lawns to Legumes program is about that. And essentially what the state of Minnesota has talked about with bee lawns is it's some kind of the Nomo fescue blend that has white clover, creeping thyme, and self-heal or heal all. And it's essentially, it's a lawn replacement. So it's lower inputs. The one thing that needs to be discussed specifically with a bee lawn is that you can't mow it. When you mow it, you set the flowers back, which again, kind of undoes the food source for bees specifically. And so again, when preparing your existing area, it's ideal to reduce competition. My yard, I think I'm the only one in the neighborhood that doesn't have irrigation, again, because we have sand. And so my yard, when I moved in, was very sparse. And so every fall, what I would do is I would just overseed my existing lawn with a with a fescue blend, essentially. Um, and fescue likes to grow in cooler temperatures. It doesn't do very well to establish when it's really hot out. So like this time of year or in the fall is the best time to seed your lawn. If you have a very lush, beautiful lawn that's existing, the best thing would be that you need to either kill off that area. And there's, again, many ways you can do it. You can sod cut, you can use herbicide, you can smother it. But you have to reduce that competition so that the fescue and the flowering species like clover can establish. Otherwise, it will take a very long time for it to grow in. And if you're patient, that shouldn't matter.
Erin, since we're on bee lawns, you do have a question. I'm transitioning areas of my lawn to fescue. It appears that the dead grass is accumulating and I expect will block water from reaching the soil. Should I be doing something? I mow it occasionally.
Yep. So when I have done research, and the U of M has actually a huge department that does research on fescues for Minnesota. And their recommendations are that you mow it at least twice a year. And then a lot of times, if you're starting to see that thatch buildup, you can run a harrow over it and pull some of that dead material out, and kind of, or dethatch, I guess. Harrow is what I would drag behind a tractor. You're not going to do that in your yard, but use a dethatcher to kind of break that up and then you would mow it. So before you mow, like that twice a year, you could run a dethatcher over it to break up some of that buildup, and then mow it so that your mower puts those into smaller pieces so that it's more easily degradable. And that should help you to keep a very healthy no-mow area. Judy, I am having trouble like scrolling on the chat. So if there's other, I don't know why, I have an Apple and so they're weird. If there's other questions that I'm not seeing, because I can only see the bottom.
Okay, Kate, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. So I'm just curious to know if you've had success in convincing homeowners to install native plants, which they might perceive as a wild look in place
Sure.
of a more traditional manicured landscape. In other
Yep.
words, have you changed their perception?
I do. And a lot of that comes from examples. So like I can talk all day standing in somebody's yard and be like, ah. And I, oh, this would be so beautiful if I put this plant here or this plant there. But most people are visual, and having a design background with interior design and working in concepts and trying to get what's I know is solid in my head into somebody else's head. I feel I have a pretty good skill set at that. But the biggest thing that I do a lot of times is I walk around with a field guide, or pull up my phone and at least show photos, and then knowing the plants and like their growth habits, I can usually, because most people want to be like, well, how tall is that going to get? And if I stand there and point, like little blue stem's going to hit me at my waist. So if we're in your yard and we're by your fence, that's going to be here. Or so it's not really that hard to convince people to switch to natives. It's just figuring out what their level of tidiness, I guess, is. Do they like a wild look? I am the laziest gardener on the planet, honestly. I am the kind of person who throws a plant in the ground. If I love it, I grab it and I'm like, try and find the place for it, but I throw it in the ground. Like I said, 3 dogs, they don't care where I put plants. And if it doesn't survive being trampled by 3 dogs chasing squirrels, then I guess you guys don't get to live, or I put you in a place where maybe you'll be protected from the thundering hooves of their feet. And a lot of times too, because my yard is big, I work in this industry. I come home at 7 o'clock at night, and in the summertime, I go out and wander around and I'd be like, oh, I totally forgot I put that in the ground. So, I'm a kind of person where I've fallen in love with native plants, mostly from the standpoint that I can just abuse the ever loving heck out of them and they still survive. So, So it's not that hard to convince people, but the true trick to it is really understanding what their level of input is going to be in the yard. Do they like to play around and fuss in the yard? Do they want it to be, pretty, um, maintenance free? Do they want structure? Do they want pops of color? Do they want it to be random? Do they want it to be systematic? So it's just like any other design project and finding that solution for them.
Thanks. And it looks like there's one more question. And
Sure.
before we say that question, Judy, you had put into the chat, and I'll just say it for everyone, that VLAMO, which is Vadnais Lakes Area Watershed Management Organization in Vadnais Heights, has a great grant share program. I was able to restore a native woodland, and they paid for quite a bit of it. It's free money. So look on their website. So I have installed a bee lawn in place of a traditional turf grass, but I'm having problems with encroaching creeping Charlie. And I'm wondering if you have any hints on dealing with this plant other than using herbicides, and maybe I just need to get out there and hand pull, huh?
Yeah, so creeping Charlie is a tenacious plant, and it actually can cause a lot of problems in our native prairies as well, especially. The city, I would say the three worst plants in the city are creeping Charlie, creeping bellflower, and garlic mustard. Are we running out of time because of Zoom? Um, and so if you look online, there are actually a lot of organic recipes. One is borax laundry soap that supposedly will kill creeping Charlie. The biggest thing with creeping Charlie is timing. And earliest in the season, like right now, is when it is most susceptible to pulling and to a treatment like borax. And I don't know the recipe, but you can just go online and go creeping Charlie and borax, and there's a million recipes out there for you. And so essentially you just spray it on, just like you would a herbicide, except it just doesn't have the detrimental effects that herbicide can have sometimes. But it's really, if you have a huge infestation, pulling is usually not effective. Again, it's one of those species that spreads, and it puts down little roots off of its runners. If you have a neighbor that doesn't care about it, and a lot of people love it. I mean, it is a beautiful little plant in the spring with the purple flowers, and sometimes you drive and you see lawns and they're just this mass of purple. And some of it's fine, but if you live next door to somebody, again, it's that being a kind neighbor and not letting your weeds, even if you love them, get out of control and into your neighbor's perfectly manicured lawn. So I was just going to say too, Judy, really quick, the Ramsey Washington Watershed District, which might overlap some people's areas, they have a fantastic grant share program and super knowledgeable people. Paige and Michael and Joe are wonderful to work with. And I don't know what you said, Kate, about, is it VLAMO? Is that what you shortened it to? We've worked with them too. They do a lot of cost sharing with rain gardens and things. They're a little different than Ramsey Washington in that you have to put a plan together and submit that for the application, where Ramsey Washington will usually create a plan for you. So
We are over our time limit, and so I want to thank Erin for doing the presentation tonight. It was very interesting, and a lot of head nodding from people who are, loving their native plants. So we appreciate that. Erin, is there a way people can get a hold of you?
Yeah, and I did not even put that up there. Did I think about that? No. The easiest would be email, and it's my name.
I will put it I'll put it in the chat for everybody.
Oh, perfect. Oh, here, look at this. Type message here, Erin. I'm sorry. God, I am so bad on computers. There you go. that's my email, and that's the easiest and this time of year most effective way to get a hold of me.
Great. Well, thank you. And I appreciate everybody who joined in today. Again, we're the Northeast Metro Climate Action, and questions or comments on our Facebook or website are certainly welcome. And thank you very much, Erin, and have a good
Oh,
day, everybody.
thanks, Judy, for inviting me. It was a real pleasure.